Thank you, Chairman Powell, for being here. I want to start talking about stress tests for mid-sized banks. Reform legislation that the Congress passed to the Dodd-Frank Act last Congress increased the threshold for stress tests from $10 billion banks to $100 billion banks. Can you tell us why so many of us still hear from banks in that window who are larger than $10 billion but smaller than $100 billion are still hearing from their examiners that they need to undergo such stress tests?
Well, let me say the new law is that banks between 10 and 100 do not have to, are exempt from the DFAST stress tests.
Yes.
That should be crystal clear. I think you're referring to the guidance,
yes,
which we're in the process of looking at and revising and I would think addressing that issue.
Okay, but to be perfectly clear, banks between $10 billion and $100 billion are not required to undergo Dodd-Frank stress tests.
Correct.
When I was in Afghanistan and Iraq, young soldiers used to complain about the rules of engagement. And if you looked at the rules of engagement that the four-star commanders had issued, they were actually pretty flexible. That had been filtered down in a different way to the front lines, though. Do you think it's possible that your guidance that you just gave gets filtered down to examiners on the front line in a slightly different way?
I think that's something that happens, yes. And I think we're looking at, there's this guidance that's still outstanding. Some of these banks are still going to want to do stress testing, and we're not going to discourage that. It's actually a good practice, but we're going to be looking at that guidance to make sure that there's no question that banks between 10 and 100 billion in assets are not required by law to do stress tests.
Okay, thank you. Because these examiners, they hold a lot of power in their hands, obviously, when they're on the front lines and they're in one of these smaller community banks. And when they say something may be voluntary, that is heard by the banker in a different way than they may intend it. Reminds me of my old basketball coach who used to have voluntary shoot-arounds before school and on Sunday afternoons. And it just so happened that the players that reported those voluntary shoot-arounds tended to be the ones that got playing time on Tuesday and Friday night.
We try to communicate, and I think our examiners do a good job, basically. But we know we need to work hard to make sure that the message gets out clearly, and we find that our people do listen. So we're alert to that.
Thank you. I want to turn now to a different question. I know there's been some talk here about the unemployment rate, which is pretty low, and the labor force participation rate, which is increasing. We'll talk about wages and wage growth. There was some recent data out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It was highlighted in a recent Wall Street Journal article that said, despite these factors, that income to employees in the form of pay of benefits continues to decrease. It's down to 52.7% of our gross domestic income. It was as high as 59% in the 1970s and 57% in 2001. By the same token, business income, profits to businesses, whether they're the biggest corporations or small businesses, have gone from 12% to up to 20%. Can you give me your thoughts on why we're seeing more income going into the hands of owners in this country and less in the hands of workers?
Yeah, so that's the labor share of income is what you're talking about. And really, if you look back through history, it zigs and zags, but it generally zigged and zagged at a higher level. And then right around the year 2000, labor share went down sharply for about 10 years, and then broadly speaking has been about flat since then. It goes up and it goes down, but it's basically flat. And the question is why. It's a really good question, and there are a lot of different answers. Honestly, there's no clear, easy answer. As a separate matter, wages are actually growing at a level that makes sense. The problem is the level. It's not the growth rate. The wages are growing. Wages and benefits are growing at around 3%, a little better. That's a healthy growth rate in an economy with 1% productivity increase and 2% inflation. The problem is there were 10 years when that didn't happen, from 2000 until 2010. So, it can have to do with a lot of globalization is a big answer there. That was right around the time of China joining the WTO. Some researchers will connect it to that. In any case, we welcome these wage increases for this reason.
Well, I do as well, and I hope that we'll continue to see them and see a little bit more of that growing economic pie going in the hands of our workers. Thanks.